Welcome to this video about Rails routing, and most specifically, RESTful routes. That is the default Rails routing mechanism. Now, routing is the process of figuring out which controller and action to call based on the path. Now, the path is up here in the address bar, and it's everything after the first slash. So it does include the first slash and everything after, and it's going to look at that and figure out which controller and what action inside of that controller to call to respond to that request. Now, by the way, this URL right here is the Rails routing guide, and you'll find that in the config/routes.rb. It actually has this URL in the comments, so you can read all about routing on this page. And also, this routes.rb file contains all of the routing code in your project. So all the routing code belongs in this routes.rb file. Now hopefully you've already learned about the HTTP and the different methods inside of it. Now the methods go on the request and is the very first word on the request. And if you notice, they're verbs: get, post, patch, delete. Those are just some of the verbs that you can use on your HTTP request when you ask for something on the internet. Now the URL, as hopefully you know, is called the Universal Resource Locator, or it might be referred to as a URI, which is Universal Resource Identifier. And basically everything on the web has a URL to access that. And we call the things on the web a resource. A resource can also be a row in your database table. So for example, I have a lot of tasks, and each task will have its own URL. And that's the full idea of this RESTful routing, is that everything on the internet has a URL. Now what you want to do with that resource that's on the internet depends upon the HTTP method you use to access it. For example, a post method means we want to create something. So if we want to create a new task, as I did in the scaffold example, we make a post request. If we want to read something, that's called a get request. So that means I want to see the information. A patch is to update, and a delete is to delete. And if you notice, the CRUD acronym that we use for databases, create, read, update, and delete, that's everything you'd want to do with a database table, is represented with these different HTTP methods. So each resource has its own URL, and what we want to do with that resource depends on which HTTP method we're going to use. And that's the basic idea of RESTful routes. Now you can see this resource routing, the Rails default, that uses RESTful routes. So you can go to this Rails routing guide and read all about this resource routing, the Rails default that we're going to use. So by putting this one line of code in your routes.rb file, it creates you a total of 7 different routes in your application, and they all map to the photos controller because we use photos up here. In my scaffold example, I use tasks instead of photos, so it uses the tasks controller. And here are the 7 different routes. Now there are routes to read, and there's our R in our CRUD, create, update, and delete. Now there are 7 different routes because in order to create something, we need a form to create it. In order to update something, we need a form to update it. So there are 7 different methods in a default Rails controller that's created by the scaffold and that we're going to create on our own in the controller video. And those 7 different methods are index, new, create, show, edit, update, and destroy. And you can see here's the HTTP verb that we're going to use, and then the path that we use, and this is the controller and the action or method we call in the controller to respond to that request. And this lists out basically what we're going to do. So if we want to see all of our photos, we make a GET request to the photos URL /photos. If we want to create a new one, again, and we're creating a new one, but we want to read the form to create a new one. So that's why it's a GET request. So this gives us back a form to create a new one, and that's the new action. And then a POST request to just photos creates a new photo. Now if you notice, the path is exactly the same, but the HTTP method we're using is different. And that's how we know to call a different method in this case and this case right here. And then finally, this is our show to be able to see one photo. And this is to get a form to edit one photo, and then to update a photo and to delete a photo. Now, by the way, this colon right here is the ID of the photo. That's the database ID of the photo that we want to see, edit, and delete. Now the routes file does one more thing for us, and that generates us a bunch of some helper methods that help us generate our HTML. These helper methods are any method called from the view to help generate HTML. So link to is a helper method. But there are also path or URL helper methods that generate the URL for a resource. So using this photos example, once again by putting this in our routes.rb file, it generates all of these routes, but it also generates a couple of path and URL helpers. For example, the photos path, whenever we call this in our view, it returns us the string /photos. And then new photo path returns us this string, edit photo path, and we need to pass in an ID here because the ID is going to be put right here in our URL, this :ID. And then edit photo path 10 would put 10 right there. Now a lot of times we also can put in the object itself. So we could take the task that knows its IDs and we could put it right here, and then the edit photo path would automatically generate the path with the ID correct in the URL. And then this of course is the show. We use this for the show, for the update, and the delete. And once again, we can either put a number here or we can put the object itself, and Rails is smart enough to ask the object for its ID so it can generate the URL for that. So these are nice little helpers that you'll see in the video that we'll use to be able to generate these paths instead of typing them out by hand for us. Now, of course, we can replace the path _path with _URL, and that includes the entire URL. So if our URL was example.com, then photos URL would return example.com/photos. So it includes the domain name, and that's just the difference between a URL and a path. So now once again, this is because we're using photos as our example. Up here we did resources photos, so that means we use the photos controller. That means the URLs are going to have photos in it, and the path and URL helpers are going to have photo or photos in it. So I use tasks as my example, so instead of photos it would be tasks path. Now you're going to have to use your own entity, so whatever you use would go right here, and make sure you pay attention to the singular, so photo, just one, or photos, more than one. You have to pay attention to that because your model will have a singular name and a plural name. So that's all for this video. Make sure you pay attention to this table, because when you take a quiz, this table will have most of the answers for you.